All right, some very recent news. Donald Trump talking about potentially ending what he calls double taxation of U.S. expats. This could potentially mean an end to the U.S.'s very unique policy of you can check out, but you can't leave the tax system. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to share with you an article from the Wall Street Journal, came out a couple days ago, and we took the time to do our own research and analysis on that. We're going to share comments from our own in-house what Michelle McCoury dubbed him at Nomad Capitalist Live, the Tax Terminator. We got together and put our analysis together, what this could mean for expats. It's just you, me, and my Barry Goldwater mug today. So let's start with the Wall Street Journal article. October 9th, Trump pledges to end double taxation of Americans abroad. The idea is the latest from the GOP nominee that goes beyond extending the 2017 tax law. Now, the 2017 tax law, you could have read the Wall Street Journal in 2018 and I think 2019. There were articles about how that hurt certain expats living overseas. So the 2017 tax law was not as great, and Doug Casey and I talked about this at Nomad Capitalist Live, as you might think. Dateline Washington, Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump says he supports lowering taxes on U.S. citizens who live abroad, marking a new attempt for the former president to win support from an often overlooked group of supporters. Now, I get hit from both sides. He's become full MAGA. I liked it when he was a real libertarian. And on the other side, I'm a crazy communist because I don't go all in with Trump on everything. It does feel to me less than a month before the election. Really, you just thought of this policy now? This is a citizenship-based taxation. It's been going on since the Civil War. And what else came out of that was birthright citizenship. You're born on U.S. soil. You are an American. That's how I was an American when I gave up U.S. citizenship. It says it right in the form. U.S. citizenship was obtained by birth in the United States. Not that both of my parents are American. And so, Trump was talking about that 9 years ago. And so, hey, you want to free Ross Ulbricht, he said? Hey, you want to do stuff that's pro-Bitcoin that our team heard him talking about at Bitcoin 2024? And now you want to end citizenship-based taxation? Hey, this all sounds great. Where you been? I'm happy to have converts, not trying to be one of those guys who says, too little, too late. Does a little bit feel like no taxes on tips. Now it's this. It's just hey, who can we get into the tent? Hey, listen, I'll take it. The U.S. has an unusual system. That's right, Wall Street Journal, for taxing its citizens on their total income, regardless of where they earned it and where they live, making the United States alone among all major countries with such a rule. And there was a rumor that Bernie Sanders had talked about ending this because it would fall under his "we're the only country in the developed world that's still taxing citizens no matter where they live. They're not using the roads and the bridges." And so the U.S. does have this. Now, if you have active income, and particularly if you're an entrepreneur, you can use the foreign earned income exclusion. If you're living in another high tax country, you can potentially use a tax treaty. There's different things you can do to reduce your income. For folks like myself who did not want to move from one frying pan to another, who wanted to go to a lower tax jurisdiction, being an entrepreneur using the foreign earned income exclusion did that. I could have, I think, continued to pay zero tax, but in recent years, not everybody can pay zero tax if you make over that foreign earned income exclusion, even in a business. So active income, you're going to pay something, but it's a lot less if you move overseas. Passive income is a different story. Passive income, they don't really exempt that so much. So people who are in Bitcoin, for example, that's why many of them give up their citizenship. It is pure, unlike in my case, it was, their case is pretty much, hey, I just don't want to pay all this tax. Other countries use systems that base taxation on where people live. So we talk about becoming what we call tax non-resident. Canadians, Australians, Germans, they are making it more difficult. They're putting more tests. They're being a bit more strict on what the rules are and how they're enforced. But you can leave their tax systems while keeping your citizenship. And then if you want to move back to the country in the future as a citizen, you can. I think they will make it more difficult. I don't know that they'll go full-scale U.S., but they'll do something like that eventually, some of them. So essentially, the article says, an American living in Paris would have tax obligations to both France and the U.S. Now, they're not going to be paying 90%, but they're going to have the tax obligations. Though the U.S. tax code already contains features meant to mitigate double taxation, a French citizen residing in New York typically wouldn't pay wouldn't owe France any taxes on U.S. income. Yes, that's correct. And there are times when if you are an American and you pay a certain amount somewhere, you need to top it up to the IRS, to the U.S., which seems unfair. You didn't, again, we help people move to pay 0% tax, 5% tax. We have some people now, hey, I'll pay 10 or 15. That's fine. I'm happy to pay something. Some still want to pay zero. Those are the places where it's harder to go. But to tell kind of the average American expat, you don't pay anything, or sorry, you're paying 25, 30%. Hey, you got to top it up a little bit to be even with us. That's one thing, and that's bad enough. But you've got to file a return. You've got to file reports for your foreign bank accounts. If you've got a foreign corporation, you've got to file all that paperwork with the U.S. government. So it's not just the obligation to pay, it's the obligation to file, it's the obligation to go through all the paperwork. We had one guy once, client many years ago, with the structure he had, it's like, hey, if he's going to make this move as an American, he's going to move overseas. I think somebody quoted as $50,000 a year to do his taxes. It was going to be that complicated for the kind of business he had. And he wasn't, the guy wasn't making $100 million a year. I think he was making $3 or $4 million a year. So that's insane for a country he literally didn't want to live in a single day. So Trump says, according to a statement he sent to the Wall Street Journal, quote unquote, I support ending the double taxation of Americans overseas, or overseas Americans. I'm going to come back to how we may interpret that in a minute. Like his prior campaign ideas to eliminate taxes on tips, Social Security benefits, and overtime pay, Trump's latest tax policy promise goes beyond extension of his expiring 2017 tax cuts and the ideas he pushed during his first term as president, and it's aimed at targeting a demographic. My opinion, and I know that most people maybe won't see why I'm saying this, but again, talk to Doug. Go watch my interview with Doug Casey. I think we touched on this a little bit. And then go back and watch my interview with Doug Casey in 2021, both done at Nomad Capitalist Live. And we kind of talked about the fact that, the right wing, it's a little bit jingoistic these days. And do we entirely trust the right wing to not want to go after expats? Because, hey, if the U.S. is the best country in the world, who would want to leave? Only a no-good, rotten traitor, of course. All right. I've been on Fox Business before. I don't remember if I've been on Fox News. But, we get a few comments people send in like, oh, you're trying to get people to leave. You don't want to stay and fight. It's like, well, I don't want to live there to begin with. And no, I don't want to fight the Goliath. No, I don't. I'd rather be happy. Something that these people, some of these political animals, I worked in talk radio and I saw people in their 70s, never been happy a day in their life. Yeah, I do not want to end up like that if that's what stay and fight looks like. But I do fear that at some point that's what a right-wing administration somewhere does. Now, this is where culture comes into play. Is if a country's culture is immigration in its history, I think there's a lot more understanding. And so you have countries like Ireland, which are smaller, and they have to be more responsive to their citizens in some ways. And people did immigrate. And so there's an understanding, hey, these people aren't bad people. They're just immigrating for their own reasons. Or I think cultures, again, smaller countries where people, where they had, like a Portugal, where they were trading all over the world. There's a greater understanding. Not everyone's going to live here. The U.S. is a rather isolated country. I think Canada and Australia, which are in that basket, which is why I've said I could see them implementing some form of citizenship-based taxation first, because there's not an awareness of all these other places, perhaps the way you have in Europe, where you're a lot closer together. So I don't. That's my opinion. I'm not saying I'm a capitalist. I generally voted for right-wing candidates unless I was protesting how bad those right-wing candidates are when I was in the U.S. But eventually I realized the right wing's not going to save you either. And as I was talking to some folks in my family the other day, they're like, the country's too far gone for anyone to save it, no matter how hard they try. So that's my belief on this. The article goes on and on. One thing says a more expansive revision of the tax code could open opportunities for wealthy Americans to move overseas, retain their citizenship, and escape some U.S. taxes. Yes, the same way that people in every other country get to do. Again, I think that a couple other countries are creeping into making it harder to leave, but the U.S. is alone. And, what's one way to test whether your country or any relationship you have, if it's 1 versus 195, or I guess in this case 2, Eritrea, versus 194, maybe you ought to listen to the other 99%. And when you don't, that says something about your culture. It's a culture of arrogance. And so here's the main point. I'm going to get into that. What Trump means by double taxation remains uncertain, and the campaign officials offered no additional details about exactly what policy change he would try to push through Congress. I don't really care who wins. I don't have a dog in this fight. Again, I've part of my leaving the U.S. and eventually giving up citizenship. I am politically homeless, and Americans have a really hard time understanding that these days. I mean, go back to my days in talk radio. You couldn't even back then, and you certainly couldn't today, have anything where, if you had a radio station, it's not just Trump, 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 or anti-Trump all day long. The anti-Trump stuff never works on talk radio. But if you're not in lockstep anymore, people are like, you're a communist. And I just look at this and I say, this just feels a little bit like pandering. Oh, the Democrats do it too. Okay, well, great. Then everybody sucks. But here's the analysis from our own in-house, what Michelle McCory called the Tax Terminator. Donald Trump has come out and stated he wants to end double taxation for Americans. What does our preliminary research indicate? The statement can mean a broad spectrum of things, and as of now, we don't have many specifics available, as the Wall Street Journal says. Trump's comments could lead to any of these scenarios, A through F. Option A, the end of citizenship-based taxation altogether. So this is the policy where no matter where you live, you at least have to file a tax return, report all your bank accounts, report your corporations, report your trusts. It's laborious. Maybe you don't owe anything due to any number of reasons. We help people, again, we help Americans lower their taxes a lot all the time, but there's still the obligation to be on the hook, even if you're getting lots of exemptions, exclusions, what have you. So, option A is they just get rid of the whole thing. Given the wording of the comment Trump made, double taxation for Americans living abroad, emphasis on double taxation, we believe this option is the least likely and do not believe the U.S. will leave expats in tax havens like Dubai or the Cayman Islands alone so easily. Why? Well, I haven't lived in the U.S. for a long time, but back then you'd watch the political attack ads, so-and-so's in favor of, giving more money to companies that ship jobs overseas. And when you get into the offshore tax game, you kind of realized, okay, I kind of understand what they're saying, but they're overly simplifying it to make the average person not like that person, not like that candidate. And so I think it would be pretty politically expedient of either party to say, you know what? Yeah, those people in France, we're going to leave them alone. But if you move to somewhere like Dubai, all bets are off. Or the Cayman Islands, we're not letting, as the article, the Wall Street Journal says, wealthy Americans could be able to live overseas and not have to pay tax anymore. Right, again, like everybody else does, and in going along with, you have to pay taxes for the roads and the bridges, even though they have roads and bridges in the Cayman Islands, and it's still 0%, but you got to pay for the schools. Well, you're not using any of those things anymore, so why would you pay? So, option A, we think, is the least likely from our own research from the Tax Terminator. Option B, a sharp increase of the foreign earned income exclusion. This is how much you can earn in active income, earned income, right? Are you doing the work? Basically, they could raise that up, and therefore, if you're a business owner or if you have a salary, more money tax-free. And this would be a good thing if they did it, because if you live what a lot of our clients do, in contrast to what the average expat does, you might be living a tax-free life. And so therefore, the more money that you're also not paying to the U.S., that's zero on one side, zero on the other side, that would be good. Now, how high are they going to raise it? Probably not into the millions. But perhaps the system stays the same, but the FEIE is increased substantially to provide much greater relief to upper middle-class American professionals, lawyers, doctors, accountants, etc. Some of whom, by the way, don't qualify for the foreign earned income exclusion because their businesses are not truly businesses. They don't fully qualify for the FEIE. And high-level workers living abroad. Yeah, I had a friend who lived in Abu Dhabi, made $1 million a year, was a U.S. citizen. He did not run that through a company because he was an employee. He couldn't. They just pay him. Here's your money. And he was paying tax on 90% of that money as if he lived in the U.S. despite living in Abu Dhabi. Big disadvantage. So option B is they exclude more money. If you're a 7 or 8 figure entrepreneur, I doubt that's ever going to keep pace. But it could be more relief. And quite frankly, the restrictions on what you make above the FAE, I mean, there are some restrictions there for sure. Option C, we might potentially see an exemption from CFC rules, controlled foreign corporation rules, for Americans living abroad, providing they meet certain conditions. For example, a U.S. citizen entrepreneur becomes a bona fide resident of a nice country. And this is what I've told you. I've suggested this a few times over the years, i.e., a country with which the USA has a tax treaty. So I've suggested, hey, some countries might kind of do like a backdoor of what the U.S. is doing, but they'll carve out countries they like. So let's say, in France, we talked about recently, one of the candidates for, was it president or prime minister, wanted to implement citizenship-based taxation. Did not get in, so fine. We will live to see another day. But my thought was always that maybe a country in Europe would say, okay, if you move to other EU countries, we can't or won't bother you. So therefore, you could move to Ireland or Malta or Cyprus and be a non-dom. If they included the broader EEA countries, you could move to Switzerland, do a lump sum. You can move to Poland for the lump sum. You can move to Italy for the lump sum, Greece for the lump sum, Spain for their program. And so theoretically, somebody who has a European passport and is afraid of this happening, but their place to move would be within the European Union, maybe that'd be more likely to stay an option. And so now our team is suggesting, hey, the U.S. might exempt you, entrepreneurs and business owners, from rules that include your companies in the equation if you move to a country with which they like. And so that may be exempted from GILTI, which is a whole new formula under the tax law on low tax and intangibles and all that kind of stuff, as well as Subpart F, which became broader under the last tax law, provided their business is also incorporated there. So it could be something where, again, let's take those non-dom countries, Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta, have relatively favorable corporate tax regimes. Now, depending on how it works, you might still have some of the same restrictions on how you use the money because of the remittance basis, but that could be one way that the U.S. could say, all right, fine, if you go to another country and you incorporate there, don't be shopping around, would be option C. You can't put your company in the Cayman Islands and then go and live in a non-dom country and then never remit the money, and you're essentially living on very, very, very low taxes. But if you incorporate in a place where there's 5 or 10 or 12.5% tax on your business, and they're on our nice list, all right, we'll leave you alone. Now, the challenge would come into play with some of the lump sum countries. Maybe Switzerland could work, although it's a lot of work for certain people. Italy wouldn't work because Italian corporations are a mess, but the lump sum's a good deal. So if you had to incorporate in the same place, that wouldn't be ideal. So you'd still be paying something, but you'd have more places to live in. And if you are the person whose wife will only move to Spain, I guess it wouldn't work for you because Spain, I don't know if they include the Canary Islands or something. Anyway, the option C is you get an exemption on some of the taxes on your business to where you just run the business if it's incorporated there, and the U.S. could leave that alone. Option D, we could potentially see capital gains tax exemptions on investments made in the country of bona fide residents of U.S. citizens abroad. For instance, a full capital gains tax exemption derived from the sale of properties or certain types of businesses provided certain criteria are met. By the way, do you know who did renounce his U.S. citizenship purportedly for tax purposes? Former UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who sold a property in London, but he was born in New York, and he therefore had a U.S. passport. The UK exempted his sale as his primary residence, and the U.S. said, well, no one else is taxing that. You're our citizen, so please send us the money. And he said how ridiculous that was. I think eventually it was surmised he paid, and then he renounced his citizenship. That's my understanding of the situation. And so could the U.S. say, if you live in a country as a bona fide resident, that's a term that's part of some of these equations, we're not going to tax you on that. But would they say, hey, you're a bona fide resident in tax-friendly Malta, but we're not going to exempt those dividend-free stocks in Singapore? That's option D, would be where you live, you might get some exemptions. Would that exempt capital gains on Bitcoin? Would seem perhaps not. Now, maybe if you hold it in an exchange in that country, I don't know how that would work. But option D could be some capital gains tax exemptions. That doesn't sound too good. Option E might be U.S. citizens who move to nice countries, again, i.e. with a tax treaty, So countries that aren't taxing zero, fully exempt from U.S. taxation, or at least to a large extent. And then option F was a combination of the previous four options. So it could be you get more foreign earned income exclusion, and they exempt capital gains where you live on certain assets. Maybe you sell a business in the country of residence and you pay some tax there, and the U.S. doesn't make you top it up. Or you sell your house and there's no capital gains tax after X years, and so the U.S. leaves you alone. Some version of that. In conclusion, our team, and this is our opinion, just from what we've read and kind of dug a little deeper. We have a couple people in house who are trained in this area, and of course we have a network of experts we work with. But in conclusion, it is unlikely, in our view, they say, that even under Donald Trump, the U.S. will completely abandon citizenship-based taxation. However, we could see increased exemptions, exceptions, and opportunities to utilize tax treaties. Proper tax planning may be needed. Probably will not mean things are as simple as just moving to another country. And again, even if you're living in Canada, it's not just as simple as just move to another country. There's still planning involved, even when there isn't citizenship-based taxation. One thing to point out here is the U.S. may potentially reconfigure the exit tax so that it's triggering people to depart the U.S. as opposed to when they renounce U.S. citizenship, i.e., again, how Canada does it. So be careful what you wish for to some extent, because if you are able to get out, it's going to be interesting to see how good are they going to make any of these improvements to double taxation, to where maybe they say, okay, listen, you can leave, and we're going to give you more exemptions, and we're going to give you certain exclusions if you move to the right place. But hey, when you leave, you have to pay the exit tax then, because we're going to have a new category of tax non-residents. So the idea that you should just sit around in the U.S. waiting forever is wrong. And what I would suggest is that might move Americans into more of a plan A camp than a plan B camp. We've had a lot of Americans who say, get me the second passport, get me the third passport, get me a house that I can move to. I'm going to start getting comfortable with that. And if things ever get squirrely enough, I might just have to push the exit button on the whole place. Whereas if you're saying, hey, I can move overseas and I can get, I can reduce my taxes more easily as an American under this law, the goal would be to move as soon as possible. Now, the goal is always to move as soon as possible if you're trying to reduce tax, because the longer you stay in, the bigger the exit tax will be. But if it's not based on expatriation and giving up your citizenship, based on simply moving abroad under one of these options or something else, then that potentially brings the obligation to pay an exit tax forward, in which case you'd want to get out sooner than later to minimize that exit tax obligation. So there's a couple good things, quote unquote, about U.S. citizenship-based taxation. One is you don't really need a tax residence somewhere else. Everyone views you as an American taxpayer. And the other one is, you have a little bit more flexibility because of that about how what you've got to do to exit the U.S. tax system. And so some of those benefits may go away if the U.S. allowed you to get out. Our view, we'll see what happens. We'll see if Trump gets elected. Our view is that citizenship-based taxation will, in some form, continue. And for me, that's just, again, part of the culture. We own you. And I push back more on the culture than the taxes, because I've said this repeatedly. I paid zero most years. I think I paid $8,000 or $9,000 one year. And other years I was out, I paid zero. I didn't have quite as unrestricted use of my money, but it didn't bother me at the time because I was able to do things. And I look back and say, I look back in retrospect and say it was a little bit messy compared to how I do it now. But back then, it's like, whatever, it's messy, it's the price of being a U.S. citizen. I wasn't paying. For me, the thing that's kind of offensive, really offensive actually, is even if you leave our country, we're going to punish you because, hey, why would you leave? This is the best place on earth. So we're going to, so even if they 10x the foreign earned income exclusion to over $1 million, number one, if you make more than $1 million, okay, cool. Number two, is it about the numbers or is it about the principle? I happen to think life's about principles. So that's our view on this. We always like to take a couple days and actually do some research rather than just talking about it. That's our view. I think Americans, want to continue to have a second passport, but I think that the equation is, if you think there's any chance of this happening, where are you at financially now, and where are you going to be at financially 5 years from now? It may be better to have some kind of plan A ready, which means you're going to be not living in the U.S. now or in the near future to take advantage of this.